So thank you, Carol, for the introduction. My name's Lia Gilmour, and as you said, I'm a PhD student. I'm actually in my final year at Bristol with Gareth and Mark. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the work that I did for my PhD. And the title of my talk today is Evaluating Methods to Deter Bats. So, with an ever-expanding human population, humans and wildlife are much more likely to come into contact. And where they come into contact and coexist, there's likely to be conflict and impacts on wildlife. Conflict between stakeholders wishing to conserve species and those with other interests, and impacts directly on the wildlife. For example, in roads or crop raiding animals such as elephants and birds, bird strikes at airports, bats being caught up in wind turbines and killed at wind turbines, and also marine mammals getting caught in fisheries equipment. Also, the encroachment of animals into the urban environment causes some conflict and impacts on those animals. So in areas where you get human-wildlife conflict and impacts, often mitigation is put in place. And an example of mitigation is deterrence. So deterrence is just where a deterrent stimulus is applied to be able to keep an animal out of an area, and is often regarded as sometimes used maybe more for sort of animals that are seen as nuisance or pest species, but more increasingly more for conservation. So, for example, beehive fences and chili pepper powder used to try and deter crop raiding elephants in Africa and Asia. Also, as I said, marine mammals getting caught up in marine fisheries, and also the depredation of fisheries, and also bird strikes and crop raiding in birds. So the idea of these deterrents are to reduce conflict and also aid conservation of species. So because I work on bats and we're all here at a bat conference, I'm just going to explain a little bit about bat deterrents. So deterrents that have shown potential in the literature include light, radar, and acoustic deterrents. So light, some bats are light averse, as some of you all know, and they'll avoid lit up areas, such as street lights or floodlit churches. But light can also be attractive to bats that are attracted to the insects that are also attracted to light, and often the UV component of light. So I decided to leave that out of my further study and focus on the radar and the acoustic. So radar or radio waves have been shown to reduce foraging activity and bat activity in Scotland around where radar was being deployed, and also a follow-on study by the same authors found that a small marine radar unit reduced foraging activity and bat activity in sort of small riparian foraging sites. So in the first year of my PhD, I wanted to look at radar and also compare with acoustic deterrents, and I found that contrary to what the Scottish authors had found, that the radar was not effective at reducing bat activity in similar foraging experiments, but the acoustic deterrents were. So I decided to focus on the acoustic deterrents for the rest of my PhD. So I'm not going to go much more into that study now, because I'm just going to talk about what I did for the rest of my PhD. So what about acoustics, or ultrasound, high-frequency sound as a bat deterrent? So as many of you probably know, bats rely on echolocation to orientate and capture prey in the environment, and therefore they're really dependent on the soundscape that they exist in. And foraging bats have been known to avoid ambient areas of ultrasound for quite some time, whether from natural sources such as turbulent water, or indeed anthropogenic noise pollution such as traffic noise. And the reason behind this, or the mechanism for why this noise is causing a deterrent effect, it's been hypothesized that it's either to do with a kind of masking or jamming effect on echolocation. So the noise actually masks the bat's ability to hear the echoes coming back from their echolocation calls from targets, or maybe even from prey-generated noises such as rustling on leaves. But it also could just be that it's an aversive stimulus, so a stressful stimulus, like a lot of animals produce a stress response to certain types of noise. So these are the two sort of mechanisms behind how this acoustic deterrence might be working. So acoustic deterrents have shown promise for use at wind turbines in North America, where bats are killed in huge numbers by being hit by the turbine blades, and also by something called barotrauma due to pressure changes in entering the rotor swept zone. And also in historic buildings. So a study done by my colleague Matt Zeal at University of Bristol and colleagues found that they were able to move bats in churches into different roosting spots away from areas where they were causing problems with their urine and feces, which were causing problems and with historic artifacts, so degrading historic artifacts. So for my PhD, I wanted to ask the following questions. So first of all, which bat deterrents work at reducing activity at foraging sites, so a kind of proof of concept. What's the range of these deterrents, so what distance over which are they working, and also what's the mechanism, so why are they working, what is the reason for the effect? So as I said, we've already looked at the radar and the acoustic in the first year of my PhD, so I decided to focus on acoustic deterrents for these next questions. So what about this effective range, so the distance over which the deterrent's working? So to look at this, I did some experiments at foraging sites, so riparian foraging sites with areas of water and a bridge, and I also developed a thermal backtracking method, which I'm going to explain to you a little bit about now, which I also did as part of my PhD. It was quite a big part of my PhD. So bats are fast-moving, night-flying targets, and they're often very difficult to visualize against a complex sort of black background or vegetation. And so using something like thermal imaging really helps us to detect these bats against a much more sort of contrasting background, the colder background, because bats produce long-wave radiation like any warm bodies, and therefore thermal imaging is really useful for imaging these night-flying animals and answering questions such as my PhD. So I used thermal footage to track bat movements, and I developed a MATLAB script along with Mark Holdroyd, my supervisor at Bristol. And this used frame-to-frame differences and background subtraction to plot movement between frames and produce bat trajectories in 2D or indeed 3D, which I'll go into a little bit later. So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because it's quite technical, but ask me afterwards if you want to know any more. So we use this method to plot trajectories, and the data that can be extracted are individual localization points, so X, Y, or even Z coordinates if we're doing 3D. And those localizations are then assigned to a particular trajectory using a set of specific parameters. And what you end up with is an imaged area, so this is just a field of view of two cameras together. And you get all of those localizations and therefore all of those trajectories of those bats, which loosely represent a bat pass in a given time frame. So I think this is probably only a few seconds at a very busy site. So we can use this data to answer questions about bat activity in the imaged area and behaviour of the bats, like my question about the effective range. So I used this method to get trajectory data at different distances from an acoustic deterrent, and I was able to look at a range of about 15 to 30 metres, so a field of view where the deterrent was pointing down the field of view, and I was able to see the effect of the deterrent over that range. So here's some results. So on the screen, we've got the distance over 15 to 30 metres on the x-axis, and a mean trajectory count, so bat activity or bat passes, up on the y-axis. Now this is just the control data, so it's reasonably random, but also sort of to do with the fact that where the bats were occupying before I put the deterrent noise on. So it gets a bit more interesting when I add the deterrent treatment. So if you have a look at the 15 metres, you can see there's quite a big reduction from control to deterrent treatment. And as you move away from the deterrent, that reduction gets a lot less. So you end up with this kind of effect, stronger effect nearer the deterrent, and that dropping off as you move away. So if we add another y-axis onto this graph, you can see the percentage reduction And we get this sort of percentage reduction of about 80% nearer the deterrent at 15 metres, and at 29 to 30 metres this drops down to about 25% reduction. So that's the reduction in bat activity compared to the control when the deterrent is playing. So to summarise, we get that 80% reduction nearer the deterrent, that drops to 25. And another study that I've done has shown that there is no significant effect of the deterrent beyond 40 metres. So we get this about 30 to 40 metre range that the deterrent is effective up to. And that's for this specific speaker in this specific scenario. So these results are backed up by acoustic data on Pipistrellus pygmaeus, Myotis species, and Nyctilus and Eptesicus, where we get a 25% reduction in activity at that 30 metres. So I placed my bat detectors, my SM2s, at 30 metres, so I was able to pick up bat calls and some effect, but also not so much of the deterrent, because obviously that's acoustic, and otherwise you can't really see what's going on with the bats. So my next question was the mechanism. So why is this deterrent working? Why are bats being deterred from the area? And to do this, I developed my bat tracking method a little bit further into 3D. And if you take two cameras, thermal imaging cameras with an overlapping field of view, and you calibrate the space using a calibration technique, you can triangulate where the bat is in that 3D space and produce one of these sort of trajectory plots. So you can see those localizations in 3D and really look at the behavior of the bats. It's a lot easier to see what's actually going on when it's in 3D. What you can also get out of this are specific trajectory characteristics such as speed, and so the average speed of a trajectory, and also the tortuosity, so how curved the flight path is that a bat is taking. And these are really useful for answering questions about behaviour. So why would I want to use these for what I'm looking at? So the way a bat flies is related to its behaviour, so its speed and its tortuosity, and how it's flying are dependent on whether it's foraging or commuting. So foraging bats tend to fly much slower and with more tortuous or curved flight paths as they chase after insects, whereas a commuting bat will fly much more directly to its source because it's either getting to foraging site or back to a roost, and it wants to minimise energy expenditure. So we get this very different type of flight. And so I decided to use this to hypothesize about my deterrence. And I thought that if that was the case with commuting, that maybe we'd get a similar case with the acoustic deterrent. So if the deterrent was causing the bats to not be able to use their echolocation, so maybe it was being masked, and therefore weren't foraging, they were much more likely to have this more direct flight path and less tortuosity and faster speed. And when we looked at this, we found exactly what we were expecting. So bats did. They flew faster and they flew more directly. And we also found this was due to the fact that they weren't foraging and some kind of effect on the echolocation. So the acoustics to back this up, and this masking effect, this mechanism behind the deterrence. So we looked at soprano pipistrelles because they were the bats that we had the most calls for. Again at 30 metres, so obviously the effect would be probably stronger nearer the deterrent, but we needed to be that far away. And we found that bats alter their echolocation calls in response to the deterrent, and they actually reduce the bandwidth of their echolocation calls to focus the signal into a smaller area of frequency in order to be able to hear the echoes over the deterrent noise. So this is quite neat. So this meant that we had some evidence for this masking effect on echolocation, and we decided that was interesting and possibly the mechanism behind what was going on. But we can't quite rule out this aversive effect, which may be happening in tandem as well, because we didn't directly test that. So there's some extra evidence for that hypothesis that the mechanism is due to an effect on foraging, and that's due to an effect on echolocation. So to summarise, deterrents show promise as a mitigation for human-bat conflict, and that's really important for bat conservation, for example, at wind turbines, as I mentioned. And these speakers have an effective range of about 30 to 40 metres. And the mechanism for deterrence is likely to be some kind of masking effect on echolocation, or indeed a mixture of masking and aversive effects. So applications include wind farms to reduce casualties and maybe diverting flight lines around roads, and other applications where human-bat conflict is an issue and bat conservation is needed. So I just want to end on a warning about the potential negative effects. I'm not advocating that everybody goes out and uses an acoustic deterrent and that it's going to be great in every scenario. We're all here because we love bats and we want to conserve them. So I really want to, hit home on the fact that these need to be used on a case-by-case basis with bat conservation as the key focus. Okay, thank you very much.